My name is Paul LaFerrier, and I'm here from Kalamazoo, Extinction Rebellion, to present this talk, and thank you all for being here on this winter day, and thanks to the local XR folks who are putting this on, and to IGE for filming it. So this is a talk that was developed a couple of years ago in the United Kingdom, and it was given hundreds of times to launch this movement with the catchy name of Extinction Rebellion. And it's, for those of us who are in it and we just call it XR, it's sort of hard to remember that first time of hearing a new movement called Extinction Rebellion and the power of those words, and largely that's what made me instantly interested in learning more about the movement. So the talk is spreading and it's evolving as we go through time. The situation is different. When this talk was initiated, the movement hadn't happened yet, and now we have some experience with it, so things are going to change. But this still provides the grounding of Extinction Rebellion, explaining to the population how we see the situation and why we're doing what we're doing. Okay, I think most people here probably have heard something about Extinction Rebellion. It's a kind of an extreme name, and we just want to assure you that we are a nonviolent, direct action, civil protest organization. This is what the UK is using to describe themselves. You can see the British spellings here. That's how you know you're getting the original slides here. And our aim is to elicit governmental action on the climate and ecological crisis. So we're ordinary people. Most of us, we're from all different walks of life. We have a lot of professors in our local group, retirees, and generally speaking, we tend to be kind of law-abiding, non-rebellious types. But we've considered the situation that we find ourselves in, and we've decided to rebel, and that's what this talk about, is why we're doing that. So Kevin and Rachel have both alluded to the emotional aspects of really grappling with the information. I certainly know it's very easy to intellectualize the situation and get very wrapped up in the science and details and probabilities, but until we really feel the magnitude, the unprecedented crisis that we're facing, it's hard to find the motivation to act, really. So any emotions are welcome, and we all go through a journey as we process this. At the bottom, you may feel relief. This is what I felt when I first learned about Extinction Rebellion, because, you know, demand number one is tell the truth, and I finally felt like someone was speaking about the situation in the serious terms without sugarcoating it. That was a new thing kind of in the communication about the climate situation. And the talk is in two parts. The first part is going to be the very broad review of the climate and ecological situation. I come from a physical science and engineering background, and I love to get into the weeds of the science, but I'm going to try not to here, and we're going to stick to the big picture. Maybe we can dip into details that people are interested in the Q&A. But we're considering the big picture here. You don't need to be versed in advanced mathematics to understand the basics of the situation. It's frighteningly simple. We're going to have a break, and then we'll get into part 2 of what we need to do. So part 1, oftentimes we hear climate in the news stories, and that's how I tend to think about the problem in terms of climate, which is really just temperature and moisture, water in all its forms, ice, water vapor, liquid water. But the ecological crisis, it's exacerbated by climate, but there's pollution, over-exploitation problems as well that are as or more serious than the climate parts. So the Earth is our life support system. Everything we need to sustain us is in the biosphere, the living layer of the Earth on the land, and then of course in the oceans. And we are in the process of destroying it in several ways. We've destabilized the climate that our species has enjoyed, the Holocene climate. We're going to a new climate. We don't know where it will be stabilized. We are overexploiting the ecosystems, which are becoming degraded, so we're destroying the ecology of the Earth. And by doing so, we're really destroying our future. The future that the older of us imagined the future would be kind of like the present, only slightly better, is not the future that we're heading toward. So, thinking first about the climate, the greenhouse effect is very simple. All of the energy coming to our planet comes from the sun, and it stays within the Earth system until it's radiated out to space again. And components in the atmosphere, particularly carbon dioxide and methane and water vapor, keep the Earth warmer than it would be. If we had no atmosphere, we would be a ball of ice, basically. So normally, or before the industrial era, the animals and plants created a dynamic equilibrium that kept carbon dioxide very stable and gave us the stable climate that our species evolved in. But we've been pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and that prevents some of the infrared radiation from going back out to space. So we've created a situation where there's an energy imbalance, and there's many ways to describe it. It's 2.5 watts per meter squared. A surface area of the Earth is the imbalance, and the average energy coming in from the sun absorbed at the surface is about 240 watts. So it's more than 1% out of balance. So this is a hockey stick graph. We learned about this at The Inconvenient Truth with Al Gore, and it shows the remarkably stable, this is only 2,000 years, but the pre-industrial CO2 was very level, and this person who put the arrow here says the industrial age began in 1840. A lot of people say 1750, but in any case, CO2 has begun to accumulate in the atmosphere, and we're at the time of the year where we start setting new records in the northern hemisphere winter, and you may have seen recently we hit the all-time high of 416. We'll be up to 419 by the time when the seasonal peak happens. We're adding about 4 parts per million per year, which is 40 per decade, and it's accelerating. So a lot of amazing science has gone into coming up with global average temperatures, and we're familiar with these kind of graphs now. There's many different groups that are coming up with these data sets. And the numbers like 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, we hear talked about are global averages. The ocean, of course, is massive and absorbs most of the excess heat and doesn't heat up as much in temperature, but the energy is still there and will eventually come out and affect the atmosphere. And that's why we have sort of a lag between the CO2 increases and the temperature increasing. But the land increases more. We're already over 1.5 on the land. And it also varies a lot with your latitude. The poles, because of Arctic amplification, are getting warm much faster than the global averages. This is just a sort of a project that this person at Hawkins came up with called warming stripes, and you can go to a website and get the warming stripes for particular countries or regions of the world. And there's no numbers on it. It's not, you can find numbers all over the place. It's just a visual representation of the climate change in the last 170 years or so. You can see even some politicians are wearing pins. You can get ties with these designs on them. Sometimes a picture communicates better than numbers. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the group that was started under a UN convention around 1990, so 3 decades ago. And thousands of scientists contribute on consensus of science to try and understand what the mechanisms of warming are and what the effects of it will be. And they put out reports every few years. And the most recent one dropped in October of 2018, and that's the one we've heard so much about. To limit the warming to 1.5 degrees C will require us to slash emissions by 45% by 2030 and to get to 0 by 2050. And when Extinction Rebellion was creating this talk, the IPCC hadn't published this report, so there was more to explain how the IPCC has always been conservative, and it represents a sort of a consensus of science. There's a cutoff date, and they have to analyze all the published peer-reviewed papers, and that process tends to be slow. It's tended to be conservative. So we used to have more in our talk about how the IPCC is too conservative, but with the latest IPCC report, which is kind of a screaming alarm in itself, even if we don't consider their limitations, they're calling for drastic action. And it's hard to explain many times to people why a degree or two, we know we're talking centigrade, and it's a little bit bigger in Fahrenheit, 1.8 times as much. What's the big deal? This is a representation that tries to show the importance of that. On the left, we see the old, say, 30-year climate normal. This would represent a particular location, could be one point or a country, and you have a distribution of temperatures that was considered normal. The middle is the sort of normal days, the blue is the cold days that would happen from year to year, and even day to day within, say, a summer month. And the orange is the hot days. So as the climate has been destabilized, and now we're shifting the mean, the peak here, I'll try and use the pointer. So we've shifted the peak just a little bit. But what's happened there is now look at the area of the orange days, which used to be the hot temperature range. We get, in this cartoon version, we get more than twice as many hot days. Furthermore, these red days, they used to be the record-setting days that were rare. Oops. Record-setting days. Now we're seeing lots of extreme hot and records being set, year after year. So it's not the average that's the problem, it's the new probability of hot and extreme hot days. You can see also, and this has been shown to be the case, that the spread is wider. In this case, it's a different number of years, so that matters, but I've seen other data that show that the variability is increasing as well as the average shifting upwards. Now, 2 degrees is something that, this is a very complicated graph, probably. It's attempting to show the whole temperature history of the Earth for 500 million years. And there's scale changes here and there. Trying to use the pointer again. This part here shows the sort of the regular oscillation between glacial and interglacial periods of the ice ages. And if we go way over here, we see those only varied by 4 to 6 degrees C. Worldwide average made the difference between, where we are now covered with thousands of feet of ice and the interglacial period that we've been in since the last 20,000 years or so. And so we're heading toward 2 degrees, which hasn't been seen for an extremely long time, and possibly toward 4 degrees, which you have to go back in the 5 million years, and when the sea levels were drastically higher and it was a completely different planet. Now, right now we're at 1.1 to 1.2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial. And the impacts we're seeing already are severe. I think I know that each of these pictures, they're all within incidents of extremes, weather, and drought in one case, that have occurred just in the last year or so, year and a half maybe. This one, actually, we think of Australia as the country that was on fire, and it was, but last summer they had massive floods. This is Queensland, Ohio, and they had extreme flooding and estimated deaths of 500,000 cattle. And in the recent fires, you may have heard estimates of 1,000 times that many dead animals, 500 million dead animals in the wildfires. This is from the Camp Fire in my former home state of California, that the town of Paradise was destroyed, 85 dead in that incident. This is Chennai, India, a city of 8 million people, and it ran out of water, so they had to truck in water, and these people are queuing to get their water. This is a Hurricane Idai that hit Mozambique last winter, I believe, or spring, which was, it happened at a sort of in a slightly different place and different time of year than the cyclones normally hit, and they were then hit by another cyclone, Kenneth, only about a month later, I believe it was. So the UK, where XR started, they're feeling it there. I'm not going to go through these. I noted just in the news yesterday, there is a cyclone hitting the UK that had an extreme low pressure. They had something like 565 flood warnings for the Isles, and that was the most in history. So that was, yesterday or the day before, I think. In the US, in Alaska, we've got the melting permafrost. Another picture of the Camp Fire, fire damages, droughts, climate migrants and refugees, extreme flooding events, king tides in Florida that create flooding in the streets on sunny days, and increased hurricanes. I particularly remember Hurricane Dorian, which was just this September, which hit the Bahamas with 185-mile-an-hour winds. And also, sat on the Bahamas for a couple of days. So 250 people are just missing from that event, presumed washed to sea. So what happens if we keep doing what we're doing and keep heating the Earth? The answer is sort of severe consequences, which we can easily project from what we're seeing now. Accelerating sea level rise due to thermal expansion and melting of ice, which will impact coastal areas. Strong storms, change in precipitation and circulation patterns, which can result in floods as well as droughts, wildfires, desertification, and potentially crop failure. Sorry about that. Famine, water shortages, displacement, and very probably conflict among nations and within nations. So right now for the past, since about 1970, you can draw a nice linear line of increasing global temperature at about 0.2 degrees per decade. So that's if it doesn't accelerate, but there's every reason to expect that it will accelerate. And there's many things that can explain that. A simple one is sort of the albedo effect. This is the ice loss reducing cooling. That's a picture of 1984 versus 2012, showing the sort of near this minimum sea ice time of the year in September. And with the less reflective ice, we get more heat being absorbed into the oceans and the land around the edges. That contributes to this other effect of methane release from thawing permafrost. So these are what in science we call positive feedback, but that's just a technical term. There's nothing positive about it. It's just a process that feeds on itself. And this famous paper came out, I believe it was summer of 2018, a hothouse Earth paper. And in it, many of the top scientists tried to outline sort of tipping points. These are different sort of subsystems of the climate, and some of them are related to each other. This version of their famous figure doesn't show all the interconnections, but if we let things go too long and we don't know exactly when these things will kick in, you have very broad ranges. The pink ones are sort of the near-term concerns. We know coral reefs are in trouble. This doesn't show that they're connected to any other systems, but they're connected to the well-being of the oceans and food stocks in the oceans, etc. The Arctic summer sea ice is related to the Greenland ice sheet. It's related to the thermohaline circulation, which is sort of the main Atlantic current from the tropics to the north that keeps Europe warmer than it should be for its latitude. We've certainly experienced fluctuations in the jet stream. Right now, the jet stream is very strong and kind of tight, but in recent years, it's gotten very loose and wavy, so the cold Arctic air comes down, and we call that the polar vortex, which brought extreme temperatures last winter to Michigan. The point is that we really cannot be messing around with these systems. It's just catastrophic if nature starts to take over. So that was the climate part, and let's talk about the ecological part. We're also destroying the planet's ecology. We can look at either the land or the oceans, and humans are having serious adverse effects on both. Basically, looking at the broad view, there's 7+ billion people now, and to feed all these people, humans have taken over a lot of the earth for our own food production, and particularly in the high-intensity industrial agriculture, it's involved clearing land that was in a more natural state, say a forest, and turning it into a monocrop food production. So forests create a certain microclimate. It's managing the moisture, the temperature in the area of the forest. And when you take that away, it's just a much less resilient piece of land. There's deforestation, a little more recent deforestation here. Not only are you losing the carbon sequestration of the trees, but yet you're changing the whole water cycle of that area. And the end result of this is desertification. When we look at ancient civilizations, we can see that they cut down forests and they created deserts. The Middle East, for instance, where civilization started, used to be much more lush than it is today. So the oceans are very important to us too. Billions of people get a lot of their protein and calories from the ocean. And also there's the plankton, which of course produce a lot of our oxygen in the atmosphere, as well as sequester carbon by their little microscopic shells, which eventually sink to the bottom of the ocean. So as the oceans get more acidified, because they're absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere, changing the pH of the ocean, that's interfering with those biological processes of shell formation and corals. So it's very, very dangerous situation we find ourselves in. There's also, of course, pollution, runoff, dead zones, plastic pollution, these other ecological problems that we're creating. And I said before, I think briefly, that the oceans absorb most of the heat, and over 90% of the heat buildup from the energy imbalance of the Earth is going into the ocean. And that's why we have kind of a climate lag, because that heat goes into the ocean temperature is barely raising, but the energy is still there. It gets distributed to deeper levels of the ocean, eventually comes out and is affecting the atmosphere. So that's why there's sort of a couple of decades lag built in between heating due to the greenhouse effect and the temperature rise. We can see on certain graphs, you can see this, that human emissions really took off in like 1950, and the temperature increase sort of took off in 1970. So you'll often hear about lags built into the system, and it's basically because of the ocean moderating or getting involved in redistribution of all the energy. So in May of 2019, it's not the Intergovernmental Panel, but it's the IPBES, which is the intergovernmental group that studies biodiversity and ecosystem services, released their big report with this headline. They didn't spell out million here, but that's 1 million species threatened with extinction, many within a few decades. And the IUCN red list is the sort of the the network of groups that track individual species, and of the ones that they track, large numbers of them, like look at mammals, 25% of the mammals that are being tracked for how endangered they are at risk of extinction. The sixth mass extinction, we've had 5 mass extinctions in Earth's history. One was related to the asteroid that supposedly caused the demise of the dinosaurs. All of these were associated with high levels of CO2. So this time, you know, we're the asteroid. This was a really interesting paper that's referenced at the bottom, a sort of a census of life on Earth. And it estimated that for just looking at mammals and the total weight of mammals, 10,000 years ago, before civilization, basically, humans were about 1% of the total mass of mammals. Now we're 36% of mammal biomass. Our livestock is 60% of the mammals, and only 4% are wild animals. So that's just a measure of how much of the Earth's biosystem has been taken over for human use. And we inherited a rich world with a lot of diverse creatures, and it would be quite a shame if our descendants did not get to enjoy the same wondrous animals that we all learned about. And of course, we're part of a food web. We eat other living things, which eat other living things, and by disrupting ecosystems to the extent we have, use of pesticides and just disruption of habitat, we are putting our own food sources at risk, both on the land and in the ocean. And this is not a smart thing to do. We're taking enormous chances. Well, I would say it's beyond that. If we continue as we are, obviously something is going to break in a big way, and we're going to be in serious trouble. So we made it through the first half, and now we're going to have that time for reflection as we think about the situation that I've presented here.
Okay, so you have a couple of options for the break. One is you eat some cookies and drink some water, or go get some fresh air, whatever works for you. Another is 2 different options I have that could help you be present to whatever you're feeling right now. Whatever you decide to do, I just want to say that I really recommend the work of Joanna Macy. If you don't know about Joanna Macy, please learn about her. She is a person who has done a lot of work around, she has a book called Active Hope, and she's done a lot of work around cultivating a sense of being able to be present to the reality of our world without giving up. And so whatever you're feeling, it's because we're all connected to the web of life. And it's very natural. We are feeling the grief and the pain of the planet and the beings that live on the planet. So it's really important to make room for whatever that is. And if you would like to do that more intentionally, you can stay in your seats, and I will lead us in like a 10-minute opportunity with that. Anybody have any questions about that? I'll tell you more about it if you decide to do that part.
Okay, this is part 2, what we need to do. The picture in the background is Banksy mural that was left during the April Rebellion in London. From this moment, despair ends and tactics begin. So our basic problem is that, we have individual denial, not that we don't believe the science, but we haven't taken it on board. We don't believe that the future is not what we thought it was going to be. It's very hard to process. And collectively, our institutions, our systems that we depend on, our governments are not acting like the situation is what we know it is. So how do we break through? Well, we need a lot of individuals to take action, and we want to recognize that we really have a moral obligation to act. In a very short period of time, a decade or two, we're going to be asking ourselves this question: if we don't act, why didn't I do something when I still could? And the youth, of course, are going to be asking their elders this. I'm sure they're already asking their elders this. We've known about all of this for 30 years and done very little. So, looking at our moral obligations, who are these to? Well, they're to the other people living on Earth right now. The climate crisis is so unjust because there was an Oxfam study that indicated that by wealth levels globally, that the bottom 50% of the wealth distribution, people below average in wealth, have contributed only 10% of the emissions, and the upper 10% have contributed 50% of the emissions. And most of those are in countries like ours and Europe and wealthy countries that are not going to be hit as hard and as quickly as the people who did very little to cause the problem. Future generations. There's already an enormous amount of injustice that the young people in this room have to deal with this problem that was created by industrial civilization and us older people until now. To ourselves, nobody is really going to be safe from the consequences. Bad things are going to happen, so we can't avoid that by inaction. And of course, the other animals, plants, creatures that we share the planet with, fish, they're going to be suffering if we don't take care of this situation or address it. So when we think about the morality of it, it's not a matter of should I do something, should we fix this, but how will we live with ourselves if we don't? So obviously people have been doing things, and Extinction Rebellion is trying to do something new and has been somewhat critical of past efforts, but obviously if it was easy to address this problem, it would have been done. And people have been doing things, enormously difficult things, to try and make changes. So as the new kids on the block, Extinction Rebellion is learning how difficult it is, and maybe to be a little more humble in our critiques, say, of what's already happened. But globally, it's obviously a global problem. We only have one atmosphere. We all share it. There's been the IPCC process with summits. There's annual meetings. And the Rio, Kyoto, and Paris in 2015 were sort of the big agreements that were reached. And really, they haven't done much. They haven't done enough. Paris was supposed to be a first step, but there's a lot of non-binding targets, a lot of pledges that are insufficient and not being met.
It's been
right? So what did we try to do at the subnational level? So when we say locally here, we really mean country by country or state by state. I'm not talking necessarily about just community level here. So all sorts of things within our current systems, legal challenges, campaigning in the UK, that just refers to sort of issue campaigning like recycle or, some little part of the problem. There's been a lot of stress on individual action because, at least we can control that a little bit, right? We can make changes in our individual lives. But that's not going to solve the problem. We need coordinated global action on a scale that's really unprecedented. This slide is titled, "None of it has worked," right? And what we see there is that the CO2 levels in the atmosphere haven't seemed to notice all of these great supposed things we've been doing. It's just going up at its slow exponential rate that it always has been doing. Fossil fuel use, right? We're switching supposedly from coal to gas, which is less bad, and it's a supposed bridge fuel, but looking at it globally, you can see from this takeoff point in 1950 that I mentioned, it's just going up and up. This is not an emissions graph, this is a sort of use graph. And you notice, we hear a lot about renewables, and of course we need to switch to renewables, but I looked up the numbers here. Renewables would be down here at 3,000 terawatt hours. Hydro is like 4,000 terawatt hours. Nuclear is 3,000 terawatt hours. So all of that less carbon intensive stuff is down here at 10 out of, say, 130 of these very big energy units. So it doesn't matter how much new clean energy you add, because that's not the problem. It's this old fossil fuel energy that's creating the problem. So why is nothing that we're doing working? Well, in Extinction Rebellion's analysis, it's structural problems, right? Short-term nature of democracies. You can debate how democratic our systems really are, and especially in the UK or the US, not very. But the politicians are elected for short terms. The incentive structure of the system does not encourage them to take responsibility for potentially controversial or short-term costly things that won't pay off for decades. Capitalism's failure to cost the future. This, again, I think this is a sort of British wording. Capitalism demands growth in our current system. It makes money now and then other people pay later. And then there's just this collective action problem. The UN is not set up to be it's not a global government. We're in a world of individual nation states that still see themselves as more or less competitors and, jockeying for power, and what they see as their own sort of narrow national interests. So we need a new approach. This is what Greta says. There are no rules for keeping fossil fuel in the ground, so we cannot win this by playing by the rules. So now we get to talk about Extinction Rebellion. It started forming and, giving this talk hundreds of times, telling people about their analysis, their plans. It launched with, I believe this is the first main actions of blocking the bridges in London in November of 2018. Here we go. So it was formed out of a group of activists who already knew each other, and they were in this movement called Rising Up. And they did a lot of small actions to test their tactics. They had a scholar named Roger Hallam, who had studied social change as a grad student at King's College and also personally gone on hunger strikes and won university divestment campaigns and rent strikes. So these were seasoned activists who had been working on smaller campaigns, and they got together and put their heads together, how are we going to address something as huge as climate change? They declared a rebellion to the press with a letter of support with signatories like Noam Chomsky, Naomi Klein, big people and influencers in the left anyway. And they blocked some bridges. They didn't know how many people would show up, but enough people showed up to sort of create a party-like atmosphere on one of the bridges across the Thames in London. And then they said, hey, this is good, let's do it a few weeks later and block 5 bridges. And they continued to build from there. It's grown rapidly since then and spread around the world. So it's a decentralized movement, and you can see it's mainly in Europe and the English-speaking world, but not surprisingly. We have a growing number of US groups, 66 that are on the national website. I know of several that are not officially listed here yet. Big cities and fairly small places have started up groups. Anyone can really start their own group. And our basic model for change is based on the idea of civil resistance. So, or nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience and civil resistance all mean slightly different things, and but it involves basically breaking the law, saying that you're not going to obey the laws of the state when the system is unjust. And so let's see, it's hard to know where to dive into this big topic here, but we know from history, Gandhi, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, these people practiced nonviolent disobedience. They broke some laws, and in the history books, most people think of them as heroes, but in their own time, they were highly controversial, criticized for being divisive, not necessarily very popular. So what are the elements of civil resistance? There's a great American theorist or scholar and creator kind of systematizing the knowledge about civil resistance named Gene Sharp, and Extinction Rebellion and other movements have relied on his work. And most of this case studies for civil resistance involve people overthrowing non-democratic governments, dictators. And generalizing from these kind of struggles that have been successful, Extinction Rebellion believes there's a few important elements. Most importantly, it's nonviolent. That's both for sort of moral reasons and tactical, strategic reasons. It needs to involve a lot of people. So Extinction Rebellion is based on the idea of a large mass of people. And that's where it's a little different than what we've experienced as direct action movements, the style of maybe Earth First or even Greenpeace, where small groups of people take very high-risk actions and face very severe legal penalties. Extinction Rebellion is trying to get ordinary people to join this movement and have massive numbers where we can go to the capital city or the important cities where the power is, where the main national media is, and essentially disrupt their ordinary life. So it needs to be disruptive so that it can't be ignored. It will get attention in the media. It will attract people who are sympathetic. But it also needs to be respectful. We're not viewing the individuals in power as our enemies, basically. We will win when they accede to our demands, or when they join us, or when they quit resisting us. So it makes it harder for us to win if we treat other people, even our opponents, disrespectfully. And it also needs to be creative and engaging and fun, not only because that's going to get the media and that's going to have more influence, but it takes a lot of time and energy to build a movement that's going to change everything. And so we need to have some fun while we're doing it, and we need to get some fulfillment out of the process. So this is from the UK again, and they started with 3 demands: tell the truth, act now, and beyond politics. That what I just said is the slogan version of the demands. And the demands, the fuller versions, you can read here. We instantly get a lot of grief by putting the year 2025 in demand 2, because everyone will tell you that's impossible. Nobody's getting net zero by 2025. So why is that there? Well, keeping in mind that they created this demand in 2018, the thinking was that this would be as fast as possible, and for reasons of justice, the advanced countries, the European countries, the rich countries, they're mostly responsible. They should be decarbonizing faster than the developing world. So, they're still improving their standard of living significantly by growing their economies. We are not creating more happiness, we're kind of wasting it. So we should be leading the way, the rich countries. And we also had a way of explaining this where we would say, we're asking for what physics demands and not caring about what's politically possible. But the UK, partly as a result of Extinction Rebellion, did create a binding law that they would be to net zero at 2025, and this is talking about 2050. So an IPCC number is sort of net zero by 2050. This is just too far away. It doesn't give anyone incentive to do something this year and next year and start the cuts now in our political system. So 2025 is proxy for act immediately, or as soon as possible, as fast as possible. People are already dying, and it's unconscionable to delay any further. We're so close to having the situation get away from us that we need to essentially a total mobilization effort as soon as we can make that happen. And the third demand for Citizens Assembly is partly because in the UK and the US and many places, the political system is so broken, so resistant to reform, that we need something kind of radically different. We don't have time to sort of fix our broken democracies so that we can then address climate. So the Citizens Assembly is a sort of a way out of this, to maybe think of it as a third branch of legislature. What it involves is sort of like a jury, but some differences too. You get a group of regular citizens together, and they're chosen by a process normally called sortition to represent the whole population, say half men, half women, whatever age ranges, social class, ethnicity, whatever demographics you want to have represented, you can invite a group of people that mirrors the population. And you could include political factors like, with the Michigan Redistricting Commission is kind of along these lines. They're going to have, a certain number of Democrats, certain number of Republicans, certain number of independents. And this assembly is then convened and given access to a variety of experts and people from different perspectives. They have a strongly facilitated process with both large and small group discussions, and they're charged with coming up with a plan to address an issue. And I think I've got another slide on this. Okay, so this is not just a crazy idea. It's been used in many jurisdictions. It's been used in Canadian provinces to tackle reform of electoral systems. Most notably, recently, it's been used in Ireland to address the abortion issue with success that the parliament there could not resolve on its own. So these are some of the advantages for the Citizens Assembly. The people there are serving, and they're not trying to get reelected. They have no vested interest in, preserving their power. So they're free from a lot of the corrupting influences. They're truly representative. If the process is run well and transparently, the outcome should be trusted by the public. And the Citizens Commission could be, ideally, maybe given authority to what they produce would just become law. But in most cases, it has to be then approved by the existing legislature. But it would have a lot of legitimacy and put a lot of pressure if we still have to get it through the Congress as it is now, say. So I'm pretty excited by the third demand, Citizens Assembly, as you might guess from all that detail. So those are the demands, and I almost forgot to mention a very important thing, that the US has added a fourth demand, which is for a just transition. And that's very important given our history of racism and unfair treatment, that we're not even going to trust fully the Citizens Assembly to come up with a solution that prioritizes the most vulnerable people and the people that have been historically burdened by the pollution from the fossil fuel industry. And the just transition also applies to the rank and file workers in those fossil fuel industries, that those people are not our enemies either, and we need to not make them bear the brunt of a transition in our energy system. So the fourth demand is catching on globally in XR. It's eventually may be added by other countries. And that shows that Extinction Rebellion is decentralized, and there's a certain core DNA to it that defines it as XR, but it's subject to local conditions and local modifications. Okay, so we have 4 demands in the US, and we have 10 principles, and I'm not going to go through all of them. One of them is that we're nonviolent. John Lennon tells us that, it's playing to the system's strength if you try and get violent, and the only thing the system can't handle is nonviolence and humor. We're decentralized, so this isn't all being steered out of some headquarters in London. Or XR UK is kind of they invented this thing, and they've had the most experience and success with it. But it's sprung up by anyone who wants to take action in the name of the demands and principles. You can start a local group. You can federate with other local groups to form regional or national groups. And truthfully, this is pretty chaotic. We're all used to being in this atomized society where we only participate in hierarchical organizations. And some of us have been involved with the Green Party or other groups that maybe do consensus type decision making, which can be its own challenge. So it's not easy to be fully decentralized, non-hierarchical, post-consensus organizing movement. But we're doing our best, and there's a lot of things we take inspiration from, new forms of our organization going by names like holacracy or sociocracy that are sort of designs for how to coordinate, how to delegate authority and coordinate without spending too much time trying to reach consensus with everyone. So I took one slide here from New York City because they're one of the bigger and better organized chapters in the US. And this kind of shows how the white groups are sort of working groups. The action is, of course, the most important thing. The affinity groups are groups of maybe 8 to 12 people who know and trust each other, who can group together to perform larger actions. And you've got all this organizing stuff that supports the action groups. You've always got to be doing outreach. This talk is, outreach. We're talking to the public and hopefully forming local groups everywhere. Now, Rachel, I think, has already touched a lot on the regenerative culture. We need to take care of ourselves to enable us to continue to be effective as activists. There's such an overwhelming sense of urgency that sometimes we want to take too much on ourselves, feel too much responsibility. That's not going to help the movement if we do that. So the regenerative culture is all about care at many levels: self-care, movement care, action care. In London, you see huge levels of support for the people who are maybe facing arrest. We're going to wait for them. We're going to bail them out. We're going to, have hot tea or whatever they like in England when they get out of jail. And also, we're going to try and, as much as we can, sort of start creating the world and the interpersonal relationships that we want to see in the transformed world that we're looking for. So, but it's all there really to support actions, because if we don't turn this big thing around, we're in big trouble, as we got into in part one. So we've got to get out there and do things. So some actions are little local actions. These are from the UK, a die-in. So these people are doing something that you just don't see every day. This may not be super disruptive, but people are going to notice. This is something different is going on. Someone's hanging a banner on the clock tower in the town square. These are things that let people know we're out here. This is going to attract people that are interested in joining our movement. These are going to build skills for larger actions. This is the New York version of the sort of same slide. This January 2019 thing was really the first news grabby thing that happened in the US for Extinction Rebellion. And they went to Rockefeller Center at the ice rink there, kind of took it over, hung a banner on the statue of Prometheus, and that was sort of the launch of Extinction Rebellion's public actions in the US. This mock funeral for the species that have already passed away is, something that many activists have done for a long time. They targeted the New York Times that used to sponsor an annual conference called Oil and Money. And so Extinction Rebellion thought that the paper of record should not be sponsoring this Oil and Money conference in New York. And they picketed, and I believe that was several arrests happening at that action. And the New York Times did, I believe, drop sponsorship of that conference. So this is my only local shot. The Kalamazoo chapter was one of our latest actions, was on Black Friday. One of those guys looks sort of like me. So the national actions are really in the UK, it's a different size country, different political system, and it was very focused on national level action. So it launched in November, as I said, and then in April, they more or less built throughout the winter to go to the streets of London and occupy, I believe it was 5 sort of places around the city. This big pink boat got dropped and sort of became a visual symbol of Extinction Rebellion. That's when that Banksy mural was created. It was left behind actually when I believe it was 8 or 10 days, they held these positions. You see a fairly large number of arrests there. And another of our principles is we believe in sort of cycles of action, reflecting on those actions, recovering our ability to act, and then going out again. And in the UK, they decided to essentially do the same thing but bigger in October. And it was bigger, but it had probably less impact because it wasn't new anymore. The authorities reacted much more, I wouldn't say harshly, but much more of a reaction. They ended up banning Extinction Rebellion to where you couldn't have more than 2 people together or something like that, which the courts immediately said was an overreach. And so that was sort of a government overreach. That's George Monbiot, who writes for The Guardian. He's maybe looking a little too happy about getting arrested. And then that October phase was the first sort of coordinated international effort where we're going to have the major cities. Oh, I'm skipping over kind of New York City's achievement where they were demanding the climate emergency, and as you probably know, many governments, including city, township, and county of Kalamazoo, have all declared climate emergencies. So these are resolutions of a couple pages of very nice words, and we're all waiting to see how governments will follow through on those, local governments mostly. But the UK did, New York City, very big city obviously, they passed one of these, and Extinction Rebellion had put pressure on them to do that, and with big demonstrations both at Wall Street and the Brooklyn Bridge in the April timeframe. So for the fall rebellion, the plan was London was going to go big again and be joined by these other major international cities, and that did happen. Chicago moved its day to October 7th, and many of us from Michigan were in Chicago on that day of October 7th. So I mentioned arrest, and that's a lot of times, that's the first thing people think of with Extinction Rebellion. But it's not for everyone, and we don't want it to be for everyone. And for every person who's willing to be arrested, there are 20 or more people working on support and making the actions happen, supporting the people who are facing that risk. So you don't have to get arrested. But if you're interested in potentially doing that, that gives us more flexibility in the kinds of things we can do. Same version for New York. You know, in New York it looks a little different police uniforms, but same deal. We need lots of people. So what else could you do? You could do social media. You could make some art. You can just attend the action and do, not put yourself in a position where you might get arrested. You can do all of the organizing that builds up to these actions. You can do outreach. You can just talk to people about us. You can not denounce us. If that's the best you can do, I'll take it, And you can start a local group, and that's what we're trying to do here in Grand Rapids. So we're near the end here, finally. Why get involved? And this is the UK. I feel a little sheepish saying we're the only game in town. So many other people are working on climate that they all have their own approaches and tactics, and I really respect all the work people are doing. But for this model of mass participation, civil resistance, networked on a national, global scale, that's what we're doing. That's Extinction Rebellion, and it is kind of new and kind of unique. So again, we don't want to be looking back on not doing everything we could in that, let's say this is the last decade where we can really avoid some of the tipping points and feedbacks. And the other thing is, it is amazingly good for your mood and gets you out of that isolated, powerless feeling that we have when we are staring at our screens of the latest horrifically bad news. So join with other people. And the people you'll meet are all people that share this view and this value and are willing to get out of their comfort zone and take a little risk. And if enough people join us, we think we have a good plan to be successful. So let's be on the right side of history. And anyone who wants to, you don't need to check with anyone, you don't need to get approval. You can sign up today. You can find your home in XR in whatever role that is right for you and with the amount of time that you have available. You can share your existing skills. We need all kinds of skills, especially on the organizing side, but art, action, media. If you've done some of this civil disobedience, law-breaking stuff, we are fortunate enough in Kalamazoo to have people with deep experience in that, super valuable. And that's it. There's some websites. I'll warn you that the US website is not that good. The Kalamazoo will just take you to our Facebook page. But rebellion.earth and rebellion.global are very slick places where you can learn all about Extinction Rebellion happening everywhere. Thank you very much.